Okay, everybody, good afternoon and welcome to this emergency briefing by the MirYam Institute as a result of the increased and more intensified rocket fire from the Gaza Strip onto various parts of the State of Israel, the ongoing riots on the Temple Mount and in Jerusalem. We felt that it was appropriate to bring you an emergency briefing by way of a foremost expert from the State of Israel. I'll introduce that individual to you very shortly. He, of course, will be in conversation with one of our more esteemed adjuncts at the Institute, David Benger, whose resume I will also bring to you in a moment or two. But ladies and gentlemen, as ever, I want to thank all of you for giving your time and your attention to this most important subject. It saddens me indeed that we have to talk about such issues during Yom Yerushalayim, the day on which the Jewish people celebrate the reunification of the city of Jerusalem. But the needs must and the circumstances dictate that we do delve in to what is now a very troubling circumstance, with some commentators asking the question, is the State of Israel on the verge of a third intifada, a third Palestinian uprising? We'll delve into that and much, much more. We'll try to contextualize the events of the day and much, much more. But on behalf of myself and on behalf of the co-founder of the MirYam Institute, Rosita Panini, I want to thank you, all of you, whether you're listening to this live or listening to this via the podcast or watching this on JBS TV. We really do appreciate your time. And we're going to try and weave in your questions. And you should all feel free to use the chat facility at the base of your Zoom box, your Zoom interface. You can write your questions there, or you can raise your hand, or you can use the Q&A facility. Now, for a little bit of context, some years ago, I warned about the fact in public speeches and in writing that while the State of Israel greatly appreciated the support of the Trump administration, which was unquestionably supportive of the State of Israel in many, many ways, without getting into the domestic American conversation, I make that statement, it was very, very clear, predictable, obvious, and inevitable that ultimately the pendulum of politics would swing. And my warning was that it would swing vociferously, not to the center, but towards the other side of the spectrum potentially, or more toward the side of the spectrum that is less favorable in terms of public statements about the State of Israel. I mention that because one of the things I hope our speakers today will get into is whether or not these activities, these riots, this violence is a consequence of the emboldening that may have come about not only by way of a more sympathetic administration in the United States of America toward the Palestinian cause, potentially a more adversarial administration towards the State of Israel, or not. We can discuss that and the various alternatives and assessment therein. And also, of course, the words and statements emanating from international organizations, from the international community, particularly from European states. So all of these things are now upon us. And I also would pose the question as to whether or not Israel has not only lost or is losing its sense of deterrence upon the Palestinian Arabs, but in fact, dare I say it, have we ourselves in Israel actually become deterred? Are we now in a reality whereby terrorist organizations decide when hostilities will begin, when they will end, and on what terms? Well, all of that remains to be seen. And as I mentioned, we have two expert analysts to pass that out for you. First of all, I would like to reiterate my thanks on behalf of the Institute to my colleague in common with Rosita Panini, Mr. Alan Langer. Alan, thank you for bringing this together at the last minute. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll roll for about 60 to 75 minutes today. So first and foremost, we are delighted to have David Hacham. David Hacham served for 30 years in various intelligence and political strategic positions in the Israel Defense Forces, including 8 years in the Gaza Strip as advisor for Arab affairs to successive commanders of the Southern Command and the coordinator of government activities in the territories. He was actively involved in the Oslo peace process and participated in the majority of meetings between Israeli leaders and Yasser Arafat. Following his military service, David Hacham was appointed advisor for Arab affairs to ministers of defense Yitzhak Mordechai, Moshe Aaron, Ehud Barak, Binyamin Ben Eliezer, Shaul Mofaz, Amir Peretz, and Moshe Bogi Ya'alon. David is the author of 2 books based upon his experiences, those being entitled Gaza in the Eye of the Storm, the inside story of the Intifada, and the land was filled by Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and his war against Israel. Sheikh Yassin being an individual, the dispatch of which from this earth David was involved with, but that's a conversation for another time. You may remember Sheikh Yassin was eliminated by way of an Israeli security operation some years ago, as indeed was his successor, Rantisi, something again that David Hacham played a role in. He's going to be interviewed today by adjunct at the MirYam Institute, David Benger. And David, thank you so very much for stepping in at a moment's notice to take this on. David is a research fellow at Harvard University. He's a recent graduate of Harvard Law School, where he served as the chapter president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under the Law and the events chair of the Harvard Law School Alliance for Israel, as well as an editor on the Journal of Law and Public Policy and the Harvard Law School National Security Journal. Previously, David was an investigative analyst at the New York DA's Major Economic Crimes Bureau, a judicial intern in the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, and a legal assistant on a trial team at the International Criminal Court. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Politics and Russian Studies from Brandeis University and a Master of Arts in Global Affairs from Tsinghua University in Beijing, where he studied as a Schwartzman Scholar. David's commentary has been published in the Boston Globe, the New York Daily News, Lawfare, Times of Israel, and elsewhere. We very much look forward to learning by way of the questions that you will pose, David. And David, we very much look forward to learning by way of your insightful responses. And reiterated thanks to our audience for being with us today. And with that, I hand the baton over to you, David. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Benjamin. I think there's so much to discuss today with you, Colonel Hacham. We're going to jump right into it. No conflict is really possible to understand without knowing the history. And that might be exponentially more true when you're talking about the Middle East and everything to do with Israel and her Arab neighbors. You are an expert, if ever there was one, on Israel's engagement with the Palestinians and its Arab neighbors. And I want you to sort of bring us up to date. Tell us about what important historical facts, as briefly as you can, to give context. What do we need to know to explain the unrest today? How did we get here? And then in the later part of the discussion, we'll get to where we go from here. So first, if you can focus on the buzzword over the last week or so has been Sheikh Jarrah. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's all about and sort of contextualize that? And
Yes.
then explain what's going on with regard to the rocket fire from Gaza. We're not shying away from any difficult questions today. So please, Colonel Hacham, the floor is yours.
Okay. I'll try, of course, to do my best. And of course, good evening to you all. Listen, Sheikh Jarrah is one of the quarters of the eastern side of the city of Jerusalem. Of course, until 1967, it was held by the Jordanians. And since the Six-Day War of 1967, it's being, under the Israeli rule. And as a matter of fact, what happened in the last couple of weeks as regard to Sheikh Jarrah is the fact that owners, Jews who owned a couple of houses in Sheikh Jarrah prior to the 1948 war, to the War of Independence of Israel, wanted to come back and to take ownership of these houses. And in accordance with a decision taken by the High Court in Israel, they were allowed to do so. I mean, the High Court in Israel gave a permit to these Jewish families to come back to their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. Of course, all the Palestinians, I'm speaking basically about the Palestinian Authority and in the same breath about Hamas, they were very upset of this decision taken by the Israeli High Court. And of course, they wanted to resist and to prevent the decision being taken place, being implemented. And this is one of the major, I would say, reasons for the eruptions that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. But this is not the whole story. When speaking about the eruption in Jerusalem, and nowadays in the Gaza Strip, and I'm speaking about the shooting of rockets from the Gaza Strip to the Israeli area. I mean, it was very much important in this regard, to emphasize that I think that for a large period of time, Hamas did not launch rockets to Jerusalem area, and this was the case today. Some rockets were launched to the area of Jerusalem, and this is by itself something which is very much important, and I would say something that can bring, dangerous effects from the Israeli side. But the whole story about what's going on, if you want to know, and I'm speaking now in a very short way, is first of all, we have to go back to the elections, which Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, decided at the end to cancel. Hamas was very much upset of this decision, and Hamas blamed not only the Palestinian Authority, but at the same time blamed Israel for being responsible for the decision to cancel the elections, because Israel did not give the permit to have elections in East Jerusalem, like it did before, by the way, in the elections in January 2006 and in the elections of January 1996 to the Palestinian Legislative Council. Israel gave a permit for the Palestinian Authority to hold the elections in East Jerusalem, not in the formal, normal way, but through, postal offices. But this time, Israel did not give an answer, and it was like interpreted as a negative answer, negative stand, negative position from the side of Israel. And this was, exploited by Abu Mazen, by Mahmoud Abbas, to say, if Israel refuses to have the elections in Jerusalem, I'm going to cancel the elections and to make it until Israel will agree. This is, in short, the circumstances which led the last round of eruption, both in East Jerusalem and in the Gaza Strip area.
And what does it mean? You said that it was significant, that it's been quite some time since rocket fire was aimed for Jerusalem, and not simply the border towns around Gaza. What does that mean? What are we to make of that?
In practical terms, it means that Hamas is ready for another round of violence, another round of military, clashes with the Israeli side, and are ready to pay the bill for what it did, for the aggressions that it did. Until now, Hamas was very much, taking care not to launch rockets via, the center area of the state of Israel, Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, and all the fire was in the adjacent area close to the Gaza Strip area. All the settlements very close to Gaza. But this time it was really a change in the attitude, in the policy of Hamas, saying this time, and they, of course, explained why they did so. They said, Jerusalem, from our point of view, is a red line, quotation, red line, which means that from the Hamas point of view, they have the ability and the freedom to react and to make aggression against Israel for the case of Jerusalem, for defending Jerusalem. And this is what they done, today. And as a matter of fact, we have seen it today with the rocket launch to the area of Jerusalem. It means in practical terms that they know that Israel this time is not going to stay calm and not to take aggressive actions. I think they understand now that Israel, the government of Israel, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are going to react, are going to take action, military action, very aggressive, very intense military actions vis-a-vis Hamas infrastructure inside Gaza Strip. And when I'm speaking about the infrastructure, the military infrastructure of Hamas, you have to make, at the same breath, you have to understand that we are speaking about infrastructure on the surface and under the surface. And here I'm indicating, of course, to the underground tunnels, which are being used for many, many years by Hamas people in Gaza.
To that point, Colonel, we actually just received a question from the audience. According to reports, the IDF says it actually recently hit an attack tunnel in Gaza just a few hours ago. And reports indicate that there were multiple Hamas terrorists inside the tunnel. How serious is this development? Is this something that we would have expected, or is this kind of a next step escalation?
Listen, the issue of the underground tunnels is not something new. I mean, even in the last operation in 2014, of course, more than 30 underground tunnels were demolished, were destroyed by the Israeli forces. We knew the threat of the tunnels, and this is why during the last couple of years, Israel completed to build the wall, underground and on the ground wall, separating the Gaza Strip from the Israeli side. And we understood until today that, I don't know, I don't have the intelligence now of how many tunnels are still operational, but I think following the building of this wall all over, I mean, the borders between Israel and the Gaza Strip, this threat is not the same, and today is not the same as it was before. But there are opportunities. There are, I mean, maybe ways that Hamas is going to send people in order to infiltrate to the Israeli side. First of all, we have to take into consideration the sea, the Mediterranean, through the sea, to come via the sea to the Israeli side. And maybe there are other, I mean, ways or maybe tunnels that we don't know about them. But I think that to a large extent, the threat of the tunnels is not valid anymore, at least not at the same, level that this threat was before. And during, I'm speaking 2014, the war inside Gaza.
So, Colonel, we've heard this before. I mean, there are some people who are concerned about a third intifada. And the common response I've heard, and in fact, I've said this myself to some people, is we need not be so worried because we have the checkpoints, we have the security barrier, the IDF has readiness that it did not have during the last two intifadas. But surely there are some blind spots, some things that we ought to be concerned about. You pointed to some of them. What should Israelis kind of be thinking about, be worried about? Where should their concerns lie, do you think? What are the weak spots, without giving away obviously any intelligence, but what do you think we should be keeping us up at night?
Listen, what I think is, first of all, you mentioned the item, this term, third intifada. I think, I mean, we dealt about this issue in a very intensive way in Israel, in a lot of forums, whether third intifada is in the cards. I think that to a large extent, this was my, appreciation, my evaluation, my assessment, that the third intifada is not something that we have to take into consideration until now. But I'll tell you frankly, following what we've seen, my first impression was that in a couple of days, this unrest, this uprising is going to be calmed. I mean, and the reasons are that we are very close to the end of the month of Ramadan. We are very close to the festival of Eid al-Fitr, which marks the end of the month of Ramadan, of the fasting in Ramadan. And I think that to a large extent, they put their, I would say, mark about what's going on. They said, Hamas said, we are here. We did the aggression. We did the, shoot fire against Israel, etc. and I thought this is going to be over. But I suggest not to be ignored of the religious Islamic motives behind, because in this case, we are speaking about a very strong, influential religious motives, being, of course, related to the Temple Mount, to Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And this is something, of course, we have to take into consideration. At the end, I think, speaking about Third Intifada, I think my assessment is that we are not going to see a large-scale eruption of Third Intifada in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. And at the end, I think that they have like a solid interest of keeping more calm when speaking about the dispute with Israel. I think that to a large extent, after the Day of Jerusalem today and the March of the Flags inside the old city of Jerusalem, and the coming of Eid al-Fitr, the festival which is marking the end of Ramadan, I think that gradually we are going to see more quietness, more calm in the area. And this is why I think at the end of the day that there will not be an eruption in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict now. I'll tell you frankly about Gaza. You know, Benjamin mentioned beforehand the last article I wrote about the elections and the uprising in the West Bank and in Jerusalem especially. I thought that Hamas is not going to react against Israel in this round, because I thought that Hamas will not want to see, you know, a reaction, a military reaction by Israel against the infrastructure of Hamas, the military infrastructure of Hamas inside Gaza, and not only Hamas, the other, you know, terrorist Islamic organization. Basically, I'm speaking about Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini. But I must admit I was wrong, because as I've told you before, I think the religious motives and the desire of Hamas to see an uprising in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, it was very much strong. And I think this time, allow me to say, from like an Israeli, I mean, I'm not in any office, any service now. I think that this time Israel has to act in a more strong way vis-a-vis Hamas in Gaza. I think that to a large extent, let me say you one word about it. I think that we have lost in the last couple of years the deterrence ability, the deterrence power vis-a-vis Hamas. Listen, you know, the Qatari envoy, Muhammad, is coming and going, entering Gaza with suitcases full with money, with dollars to Hamas, which is, I mean, seemingly they say it's for poor families, but at the end of the day, some percentage of it are going to the military, you know, infrastructure of Hamas inside Gaza. And this is being served for aggression and for terror actions vis-a-vis the state of Israel. We are speaking about Israeli, I would say, very much being patient not to enter Gaza, not to launch any military activity inside Gaza. And I think that to a large extent, this was a very mistaken policy taken by the state of Israel, by the government of Israel. And I think that today we see a change, I would say a very prominent, very cut and clear change in the attitude, in the policy of the government of Israel vis-a-vis Hamas and the rest of the terror Islamic organizations operating inside Gaza.
Just a quick follow-up question on that. You talked about the religious motivations. We have seen, however, evidence that weapons are being stored at Al-Aqsa and other mosques, right? The question for you is, and I'm really curious to know, how seriously should we be taking the religious motivations or the religious arguments made by the Palestinians? Do we really believe that their arguments in terms of their claims to specific land, in terms of their claims for the legitimacy of their fight, do we really believe that it's based on true faith and their religion? Or do you think it's simply cover for a different ideology?
Listen, first of all, in principle, and as I've told you, you know that I was 8 years in the Gaza Strip during the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising. During this period of time, we honored the mosques. I mean, Israeli troops, Israeli military people did not enter to the mosques in order to honor the mosque. But there is a difference between honor of religious values, honor the mosques as a place for worship, for praying, etc., and the line is being, taken to the other side when we are speaking about exploiting the mosques to military aggression, military threats, military actions vis-a-vis the Israeli soldiers. And I think this is the main issue in this regard. We have in principle to honor the religious values of the Palestinians, the Muslims, to let them to have a freedom of worship inside the mosque, inside Al-Aqsa Mosque. But when it comes to using the mosque as a holy place for aggression against the state of Israel, for aggression, violent aggressions vis-a-vis the police, the policemen in the Temple Mount, this is like, from my point of view, it's a red line that Israel has to act. And this is what was done in Jerusalem during the last couple of days by the Israeli police when speaking about the measures, the steps taken by the police in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. We have to honor the worship, to honor the values, the religious values, to let the Muslims make their prayers inside the mosque, but at the same time, when the line is being passed, this is like a reason for the Israeli side to take actions in this regard.
Okay, I have another question about the cause of what's going on today. What role does the United States have to play in this conversation? I've heard an argument from certain sources that during the 4 years of the Trump administration, there was peace in Israel. Now Biden is in office and we have chaos in the streets of Jerusalem. That seems far too simplistic for my taste, but I wonder what your response is to that argument.
Listen, I don't want to enter to internal domestic American policy, political issues, but I have a very cut and clear, I would say, observation of the American, of the United States position vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I'll tell you frankly, and we have to say it in a very clear and cut and honest way, I think that the administration of President Trump, the Trump administration, was very much in favor of the state of Israel. I would say more than that, I think that the policy taken by the Trump administration was not balanced vis-a-vis Israel from the one side and the Palestinians from the other side. And we have seen it in many, I would say, moves taken by the American administration under Trump presidency. And this was a very cut and clear policy by Trump. And I think we have to pay tribute. We have to thank Trump for this policy vis-a-vis the state of Israel. And I'll tell you frankly, now I see, I don't want to say the opposite, administration, but we see now a totally different attitude, policy lines, stance taken by Biden administration. I'll tell you frankly, until now, we are speaking now about 100 days for the new administration. I think that to a large extent, what we've seen in these 100 days is that the Biden administration is not totally employed, totally taking actions as regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As a matter of fact, the Biden administration is more concentrated in domestic issues, the pandemic of the corona pandemic, and maybe some economic, issues or bad developments that occurred in the last couple of years. and the Biden administration has less, I would say, less desire to be involved in foreign policy problems like the Israeli-Palestinian. But I would like to tell you in this regard that at the end of the day, we expect the American administration not to be biased to one side. In this case, when I'm speaking about that Biden administration, to the Palestinian one. And this is something that we have to take into consideration, not only as regard to the Palestinian issue, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but in the same breath, I'm speaking first and foremost about the Iranian desire, the Iranian efforts, attempts to reach at the end of the day, nuclear military capability. This is something, I mean, it's very cut and clear in this regard. What is the Israeli stand? What is the Israeli position when speaking with a new American administration about the issue of Iran? So in this regard, we expect the Americans to be more, I would say, neutral, not to act in a very aggressive or way in favor of the Palestinians, to try to calm down as much as possible the situation. And I think in this regard, they will find Israel as a partner, because I'll tell you frankly, we as Israel, we don't have any, I would say, desire to see, problems and the new intifada in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. We'd like to see calm, we'd like to see safety, we'd like to see things going smoothly.
So, Colonel,
I'll tell you, frankly, there is one problem from the side of the Palestinians. You have to know what is the situation now in the Palestinian side. As a matter of fact, we are in the twilight time of Abu Mazen, of Mahmoud Abbas. He is 85 years old, not so healthy person. And now, I don't know if you are familiar, in the last couple of years, basically last year, a year before, there is a very intensive struggle of succession. There are several people, several leaders in the Palestinian side, Fatah members, which are trying to take the upper hand after the period of time of President Abbas is going to be over. This is another issue which is very active under the scene when speaking about the Palestinian side.
So, Colonel, I'm just sort of jumping off what you were saying. We actually got two wonderful questions from the audience that I'm going to combine into one for you. First is, how is this particular round of violence and unrest affecting the morale, the kind of spirit, the feeling of Israelis on the ground, both Jewish and Arab? And the second part of the question, the kind of more tachlis part of the question, is what will the impact then be on the formation of the next governing coalition, and in particular, the relationship between Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, and Mansour Abbas?
Listen, two very great questions, really. I'll tell you frankly, when speaking about the morale of the Israeli public, of the Israeli population, first and foremost, we have to deal with the people, living aside to the borders with Gaza, what we call in Hebrew, Otef Gaza. Adjacent, the neighborhood adjacent to the Gaza Strip area. There, I think that for a long period of time, since 2000 and up, they are suffering from the launching of fire, from the rockets being shot from Gaza. And until now, the Hamas and the other terrorist organizations inside Gaza concentrated their attacks to the areas just adjacent to the Gaza Strip. And they are living in a very, very delicate, sensitive situation, problematic situation in terms of security. And I think that, only today I saw in the Israeli TV some interviews taken with people from the areas adjacent to the Gaza Strip. And they spoke very, I would say, in a very aggressive way. They say, we anticipate, we hope that the Israeli government at the end of the day will take action, will take serious military actions vis-a-vis the Hamas and the other organization infrastructure inside Gaza. We cannot live anymore with the aggression being taking place from the Gaza Strip. Now we saw the rockets being launched to the area of Jerusalem. I think that today, this feeling of the Israeli government now reached its peak in terms of now taking a serious, military action, military operation inside Gaza in order to demolish, to destroy as much as we can the Hamas and the other organization infrastructure inside Gaza. This is something we have to take into consideration. But I'll tell you frankly, the morale of the Israeli population is not down. We know that we have a military force that we can rely on. We have seen it in the past. We're going to see it in the future. I personally believe in the new chief of staff, Kochavi, and I think that the right decision, military decisions, military operations will be taking place. You asked me about the political issue, about the coalition. Now Mr. Bennett and Mr. Lapid are trying to form a new coalition. It's not the coalition which Israel is ideal for Israel. I'll tell you frankly, I don't want to enter into politics, but I myself think that Mr. Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, was a very good prime minister to Israel. I think he represented Israel abroad in a very skillful way. I think he's very effective in being prime minister. And I, to a large extent, think that the right-wing camp in the Israeli political life is more appropriate to take, the lead, to lead the state of Israel now. And this is why I think at the end of the day, by the way, I think that the last, terrorist acts by Hamas is not going to help both Lapid and Bennett to form a coalition at the end of the day. You know why? First and foremost, because the Arab Party, which is going to be part of the coalition, inside or from the outside. I'm speaking about Mansour Abbas, the Islamic Party inside it's an Arab party inside the state of Israel, with 4 seats in the Israeli Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. I think at the end of the day, there will be some hesitations of Mansour Abbas to enter to the new government of Lapid and Bennett. And this is what's going to spoil all the attempts in order to form this government. In any way, we have to wait and see, because the things are not very, not ended yet.
So thank you, Colonel. I just have one final question for you, and then we're going to bring in Benjamin Anthony, who has a short series of questions that he wants to ask you as well before we close.
Okay, go ahead.
So I like to close these discussions on as much of a positive note as possible. And we got a good question from the audience here, which is, even among this chaos and this turbulence, where do you find joy? Where do you find hope on this Yom Yerushalayim? Where does your positive spirit come from?
Yes, I'll tell you frankly, first of all, my positive spirit comes from my family, my grandchildren. I mean, the ordinary life here in Israel, which was not affected by the threats of Hamas and the launching of fire against Israeli civilian targets. At the end of the day, this is like I'm speaking on a private level. But if you ask me on a national level, I think at the end of the day, we shouldn't forget the miracle happened to the state of Israel since its establishment in 1948. Listen carefully to what I'm saying. From time to time, I'm thinking about the balance of power. I'm thinking about the balance between Israel and the Arab countries surrounding us. We are only 6-7 million Jews here, surrounding by hundreds of millions of Arabs and Muslims, including Iran, etc., etc. And Israel exists. Israel is going on. Israel is leading the world in many majors, medical issues, inventive issues, computers, etc., etc. So I think that at the end of the day, we have to be proud about our achievement here in Israel. And at the same time, I must tell you something. You mentioned beforehand the Day of Jerusalem, Yom Yerushalayim. Listen carefully. It was the dream of Jewish generations, or generations of the Jews, since the destruction of the first temple and the second temple in 70 AC, to come back to Jerusalem, to rebuild maybe the Bet HaMikdash, the temple in the Temple Mount. I'm not speaking about only religious, motives or aspirations. I'm speaking about national aspiration. At the end of the day, the Six-Day War, the liberation of Jerusalem, Israeli sovereignty was taken in East Jerusalem as well, and Jerusalem is one united capital of the state of Israel. By the way, it was taken by Menachem Begin when he was prime minister, like 40 years ago. And we are living like, I think it's a dream that comes true, or came through and going on to be true in the future. And this is something we shouldn't ignore, we shouldn't forget, that at the end of the day, the achievements of the state of Israel since its establishment is something that you can be proud of as an Israeli.
Thank you, Colonel. And we had Ambassador Danny Ayalon on earlier today, and he mentioned that we are the luckiest generation of Jews and of something like 100 generations to have our homeland back. And so it's really inspiring to hear you echo that. With that, I'll hand the mic over to Benjamin, who had a series of questions prepared for you. So thank you for your time, Colonel. I appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much, David. I hope I can be heard. Can you hear me, David?
I hear you, yes.
Great. David Benger, first of all, thank you so very much for enriching the conversations that we do by way of your questions. I hope that you'll continue to remain with us until we come to the conclusion of this briefing. David, what I'd like to do is dive in with a few questions that are Israel-centric, or that really are most appropriately asked by somebody who lives in the States, or currently in the United States. And I'd like your insight on them. I'm going to try and bring this in across approximately 15 minutes, if that's all right. And feel free to agree with me, disagree with me, be as candid as ever you are, and let your expertise raise the level of our audience's understanding and my own understanding. So the first question I've got for you, David, really stems from politics. Minister of Defense Benny Gantz was against, by all reports, and I have those reports from very close sources indeed, he was against a far-ranging operation in the Gaza Strip back in 2014, prior to the events of Operation Protective Edge. You'll remember, for example, that Naftali Bennett was someone who was credited with bringing the urgency to the Security Cabinet that he felt was lacking prior to Operation Protective Edge. Benny Gantz, of course, being the chief of the General Staff at that time.
Yes.
So let me ask you, there's an adage that comes from American politics. It says, never let a good crisis go to waste. So does the fact that Benny Gantz is currently in negotiations for a role in the Change Coalition, that would be the coalition that is the alternative to Prime Minister Netanyahu, does the fact that he's currently in those negotiations mean that he might look more favorably upon that large-scale operation today than he did back in 2014? And could we see his political imperatives and considerations dictate policy in the Gaza Strip in the near term? That's the first of 3-4 questions.
Listen, it's not only a question, it's like a hand grenade that you put here. I don't want to enter to the mind of concrete persons. I'm not aware of the motives of the reasons behind the stance taken by Benny Gantz. I know him as chief of staff. I was in many meetings in his office when he was the chief of the general staff of the IDF. But at the same time, you mentioned the issue of Gaza, and let me say something in principle. I think that to a large extent, those who are not in favor of a military action, military operation taking place in Gaza are doing so on the basis of the fear, or as an outcome of the fear, that Israel will find itself re-involved again inside Gaza. And this is something which is frightening many Israelis, among them me. You know, I was in Gaza 8 years as a military person, as a military guy. I know what does Gaza mean in terms of military, operations. Gaza is a very condensed area. Gaza is full with people who are living in like refugee camps in the poor, conditions inside Gaza. I know the motives of the people. I know Hamas and what is the attitude and the stand and position vis-a-vis the state of Israel. I think that any action which is going to be taken in Gaza, Israel must know in the beginning that this military action won't bring Israel again to conquer Gaza and to rule Gaza and to have, taken responsibility for the population. This is a heavy, heavy burden for the Israeli side. And this is why I agree with what's going on. Right now, what we have seen, as a reaction to what happened from Gaza, from the launching of rockets to the Israeli side, is like aerial attacks, these against, places of Hamas, military infrastructure. I think that to a large extent, we are going to see some killings of, of activists, of military activists, of Hamas and the other organization, if, of course, the situation will allow. But I don't think at the end of the day that the IDF is going to enter and to stay inside Gaza. There is an ability of Israeli troops to enter, Israeli forces, military forces to enter, but at the same time, taking into consideration that we are not going to stay for a long period of time. We don't want to reconquer Gaza. The strategic aim of Israel vis-a-vis Gaza is lowering the ability, the military ability of Hamas and the other organization, mainly Al-Jihad al-Islami Palestini, to be like a terrorist threat to the state of Israel. And this is something, that Israel has to adopt, I think, when we are speaking about round of escalation in Gaza now.
So let me ask you another question from the other side of the political haggling that's going on. Prior to the first 3 election cycles in Israel, we heard Prime Minister Netanyahu promise a far-reaching military operation inside the Gaza Strip. You'll remember he had to leave the stage, I believe it was in Ashkelon or Ashdod, when he was speaking there during one of the political in Ashdod. And he said that he would have, the moment he received the mandate from the people by way of the upcoming elections, that he would bring about a fundamental change within the Gaza Strip by way of a military operation. Now, let me ask you this. He's still prime minister. He doesn't hold the mandate for bringing about a coalition at this time, but he is still the prime minister, the acting prime minister. Would a major military operation now, at this stage, be something that he might view as to his political advantage?
The answer is cut and clear, positive, yes.
He would.
He would. I think that the fact that he is we are in an interim political period of time in Israel, in terms of the government and the cabinet, etc., and the elections, I think that at the end of the day, the patience of Israel has like a border. You cannot be patient anymore. And this is why I'm saying that now, this is the day to take real military actions against Hamas and the other terrorist organization operating from Gaza. This is something we have to do it. Again, I told you beforehand, while being very careful not to enter Gaza in order to stay in Gaza. This is out of question from my point of view, as somebody who knows what Gaza means in terms of being like a soldier inside this populated area. And I think this time we have to see a more strong military operations inside Gaza against the infrastructure of Hamas. I'm not speaking, of course, of hurting any civilians inside Gaza, but those who are behind the terrorist activities inside Gaza, Hamas and the other organizations, must pay the bill in terms of Israeli military
So do you think, David, and I just have two, maximum three more questions for you, and as I said, I want to bring this in at a reasonable time. Do you think that, given that this is to Prime Minister Netanyahu's political advantage, that we might see that far-ranging operation take place, even if it's not necessarily appropriate in your calculus for the state of Israel and the soldiers of Israel writ large? In other words, could Netanyahu leap on this opportunity out of political considerations?
Listen, I think at the end of the day, I want to believe that when Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli cabinet is taking decisions, the decisions are taken from pure motives and pure targets, and not out of, political considerations here or there. And in this regard, I think that for a long period of time, we were very much delicate, not willing to enter Gaza in a military operation, trying, to ease the tension in a very smooth way, not in an aggressive military way. But the time has come to take hard decisions in terms of Hamas inside Gaza. Listen, as I've told you before, I think that our ability to press upon Hamas was to a large extent being disappeared. Hamas is more in a state of mind of being aggressive vis-a-vis the state of Israel. And this is something we have to change. We have to change the equation that was in the last couple of years when we are speaking about the Gaza Strip area.
So let's move on to another couple of points, David. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. In the last several rounds, again, of elections, political debate in the state of Israel revolved largely around one topic, unfortunately. And that topic, it was, do we want Prime Minister Netanyahu to continue as Prime Minister, or do we want simply a change from Prime Minister Netanyahu? Now, I found that very, very, very troubling. And the reason for that is that the state of Israel cannot afford to act as though its neighbors are, Canada and Mexico. It lives in a tough part of the world. It lives in a difficult area of the world. And to act as though we can have electoral cycles again and again and again and again without policy debates is to really dabble almost in a parallel universe. Now, don't these events within the Gaza Strip and on the Temple Mount and in Jerusalem, do they not demonstrate that Israel simply cannot allow itself to enter into endless cycles of elections absent any substantive debate about policy matters? And if I can ask a follow-up question, do you think that Hamas and other relevant players have noticed an absence of a functioning Israeli government and become emboldened by way of that and more ready to test the limits of Israel's political challenges and military responses? There's that phrase, Yesh Melech B'Yerushalayim, there's a king in Jerusalem. Perhaps our enemies, our opponents, are viewing the situation as there being no king in Jerusalem at the time, in the absence of a government. What do you say about all of that?
First of all, as regard to the second part of your question, I think that Hamas knows what's going in the political system in Israel. Hamas is aware of the fact that there is not a permanent government ruling in Jerusalem, and they are exploiting the fact that today the Israeli side, in terms of political, in terms of politics, is very weak, and they are exploiting this situation in order to make aggressions against Israel. And this is something, of course, we have to take into consideration. As regard to the second part of your question, listen, I think as an Israeli, I must admit, I think that we need, the leadership of Israel, the political leadership, the security, military leadership, to be with people with experience, experienced people. We are not going to make tests, in politics in the future over the security of the state of Israel. This is why I told you beforehand, Netanyahu is more than 10 years prime minister. He showed his ability. He showed his capabilities. He showed his, relations with the rest of the world. He represents very effectively the state of Israel. I think for the time being, we don't need any experiments in politics, any political experiments in terms of who is going to lead the state of Israel now. We are in a time of crisis, in a very, sensitive period of time in terms of our relations with the Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority. We need a man with experience, with power, with strength to take decisions, the right decisions in order to lead Israel to the future. And this is why I think nowadays we don't need, experiments in this political system. This is my thinking. I don't know, Machaneh HaShinui, the change camp is considering something else. At the end of the day, what will happen, listen to me very carefully, Benjamin. I think that the efforts to create a new government of the change camp, Bennett, Lapid, etc., is going to fail. First and foremost, I'm speaking because of what Israel is doing now in Gaza, because the party of Mansour Abbas, I think, is not going to enter to the coalition. And again, we will stand with Bennett and Lapid will stand with no 61 seats in the Israeli Knesset, in the Israeli parliament.
David, I'm going to ask you one last question, and it's actually a corollary of what you've just said. You've spoken about Prime Minister Netanyahu, and you've spoken about him personally, not the government around him, not the security establishment around him, but him personally and all that he brings to the role of being Prime Minister, that experience and the bona fides that he has, the relationships that he has with people. So let me ask you this question. In the event that there is a major operation in the Gaza Strip, if that happens, if it happens in accordance with your caveat, which is it must be that we do not remain inside the Gaza Strip in the event that we do launch a major military incursion there. But in any event, such an operation requires solid military leadership, strategic leadership, diplomatic gravitas and relationships and experience. All of those are found in abundance within Prime Minister Netanyahu. I don't think that anybody questions that, not even his political opponents. Do you feel that a coalition comprised of Bennett, Lapid, Gantz, Horowitz, of Meretz and other such parties, do you think that even a coalition comprised of those individuals coalescing behind a government or coalescing to form a government, can they together rise to the level that Prime Minister Netanyahu has deployed so successfully during previous military operations? Or do you view that coalition, again, of Bennett, Lapid, Gantz, Horowitz and others, would you view that more as a liability than an asset at this time in the context of dealing with the Gaza Strip and, frankly, dealing with the uprisings, the ongoing uprisings and challenges in Jerusalem?
Again, it's a wonderful question. I'll tell you frankly, first of all, you have to look back into the history of the state of Israel. In times of emergency,
got 4 minutes, David. We've only got
only 4 minutes. I'll do it in a very short way. You know, in times of emergency in Israel, in the last 70 years, I remember the Six-Day War of 1967. I remember Moshe Dayan coming to the Israeli cabinet and being appointed as Minister of Defense, while Levi Eshkol, the Prime Minister, agreed to give him the portfolio of Minister of Defense. I remember Menachem Begin entering the government in 1967. I remember in times of emergency that all the political parties, all the political elements inside the political system in Israel joined together, united together in order to cope and to take actions vis-a-vis the threats from our enemies. I'll tell you frankly, this time, I'm not sure whether Netanyahu has the backing of all the political system, the political parties inside the Israeli Knesset, inside the Israeli parliament. I want to believe that in this time of crisis, and of course, if this crisis is going to be developed and to be like a major military operation inside Gaza, and activities in the West Bank in order to destroy all the terrorist infrastructure in the area of the West Bank. I would like to see some kind of unity inside the Israeli political system, but I'll tell you frankly, this time I doubt whether this kind of unity is going to appear. I would like to believe that it will be, but I'm not sure whether this unity is going to be taken place in the Israeli political system. In any way, I think that I support the decisions taken by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, and I think that he's doing right in terms of taking military actions, very, aggressive one against Hamas in the Gaza Strip area in order to change the equation that was reached in the last couple of years between the IDF, the Israeli Defense Ministry, and the Hamas inside Gaza.
Well, David, I want to thank you so very much. Of course, we could go on, but time doesn't permit. I just would reiterate that the state and the people of Israel do not have the space and the luxury to divide themselves against one another, because as we see, others are uniting in order to destroy us. May they remain a minority, may they remain on the periphery, may they, frankly, those who do so, may they be swept from the face of the earth, so murderous are their intentions. Rockets on Jerusalem, rockets on school children. These are really just heinous acts that are taking place. And I do very much hope that we will soon put out that fire that emanates from the Gaza Strip, and of course, calm tensions in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, in the area surrounding the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and also in Jerusalem writ large. David, I want to thank you so very much for taking part in this webinar. Thank you for coming on for an emergency briefing. I also want to express our profound thanks to David Benger, who really, there you are, David, who really weighed in and conducted the vast majority of this interview in a manner that, David, I can tell you, continues to educate me and our listeners. And I certainly appreciate the different perspectives that you're uniquely able to bring to any conversation in which you engage. Thank you very much. I want to thank Rosita Panini, co-founder of the MirYam Institute. Thank you, Rosita, for helping to get this done, and Alan Langer for bringing this about today. And most importantly, to you, the listeners, whether you're on this live cast or a postcast podcast or seeing this on television, we greatly appreciate your support for the state of Israel, for the people of Israel, and your prayers for the peace of Jerusalem. Thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to reconvening, hopefully in less troubled times in the very near future. Thank you all.
Thank you.